Thank you, Dean Fisher, for that generous introduction. Dean Fisher, other deans, faculty, families, friends, members of the graduating class. I am so grateful to you all, and especially to you, the newest graduates of the premier public law school in the great state of Connecticut, for including me in your graduation. We're here to congratulate you and to send you off, but I also want to congratulate your loved ones here today. Behind every UConn law graduate is a supportive family, presumably now perilously close to bankruptcy. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I did not truly appreciate what my parents had done for me until I became a parent myself. If part of my job today is to give you advice based on my experience, here is my first bit. Don't wait. Don't wait. Look to your parents and all the wonderful people who helped you make it to this point and thank them. In preparing to speak to you today, I thought back on my own law school experience more than 30 years ago. When I sat where you are now, I never dreamed I would someday be a judge. You cannot know where your own path will take you. But this law school is a source of many leaders. Look around you. Look at your classmates. These are the people the press may someday track down when you are nominated for some high post. So it might be a good time to agree now that what happened at UConn stays at UConn. You've spent 3 years and countless hours getting here. Today, you earn your law degree. Many people will understand that degree foremost as a source of authority, a sign that you are an expert on all things legal. When I was nearing the end of my own legal education, I had one of my first experiences exercising my own newfound lawyerly authority. My dad rented a huge TV so that everyone could watch the Red Sox win the 1986 World Series. Well, it turns out that he and millions of other Sox fans who had awaited that victory for more than 68 years still had 18 more to go. My heartbroken dad returned the TV. The guy was already down, but then the rental company claimed it had no record of the return. So they assessed late charges, they threatened to keep doing so until he brought back the TV set that he didn't have anymore. So my dad called me in a panic. What are my rights? Next thing, I was on the phone with the rental place. I understand you failed to retain records regarding my father's rental. Well, I'm a lawyer, and just like that, the store dropped the issue. Okay, you're not quite lawyers yet, but I'm guessing some of you have already had similar experiences. I can admit today, I didn't know what my dad's rights with the rental company actually were. Property? Contract? The rule against perpetuities? But when you speak as a lawyer, you have power. You have power. That power is real. Let's be honest, it's part of what attracts us to law school. All right, you've earned it, UConn law graduates. Feel your power. Come on, feel your power. And of course, use it well. Use it well. Just how to do that, it turns out, is not so simple. Many people, like my dad, assume that those who have earned law degrees have the answers to every legal quandary. Sometimes that fiction can be useful, but you have seen behind the curtain. Law school has taught you there's rarely just one answer. Your casebooks were full of pairs of virtually identical cases that came out in opposite ways, and your law professors marched you this way through an utterly persuasive majority opinion only to turn around and march you that way through an utterly persuasive dissent. Most really hard legal problems are contestable, and lawyers, we spend our careers contesting them. I remember when law school's no right answers theory of the universe first hit home for me. As a second-year student, I helped to teach legal research and writing to first years. Sitting there with the new students on the lawn in early fall, it really struck me how confidently they talked about justice. They knew what justice looked like. They just couldn't wait to get their hands on the legal answers that they could use and go out and change the world. As the new students talked about the conflicts and problems they were so sure they could fix, I found myself thinking, it's more complicated. What about the precedents? You're not considering relative institutional capacities or problems of administrability, not to mention unintended consequences and perverse incentives. In that moment, I realized how much just 1 year of law school had changed me. My 2L self understood. Our education was more full of questions than answers. This training in how to ask more and better questions is designed to make you an effective advocate, to better know your own and your opponent's strengths and weaknesses. But it's more than just a technique. It's also a reflection of the reality of the pluralist democratic nation in which we live. I don't have to tell you that Americans can look at the same event and see it differently. We can read the same Constitution and the same laws, but fail to see eye to eye on what they require. Your clients will care about and want things that will bring them into conflict. Sitting here today, this group of hundreds of people, you care. You care deeply about different and even conflicting things for yourselves, for the broader society. I take as my task in talking to you today to try to offer some bit of advice that I can glean from my own experience. And the advice that I thought would be most valuable is how to best use your authority as lawyers in the face of what divides us. I promise you, Dean Fisher and I did not coordinate, but we are on the same page in this regard. So I spent some time thinking back over my entire legal career, and I found it not all that easy to distill that takeaway, but I'm gonna try by sharing some of my own journey and where it has taken me. My first permanent job was as a civil rights lawyer with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. There was so much to do at work that I didn't have much time to sit around and worry about existential meaning and grand theories. Where law school had left me full of questions and critiques, the practice of law and my clients' direct confrontations with discrimination re-engaged my reflexes about justice and equality. It brought me back to my ideals, and it pushed me, armed with my law degree, into action. Starting with that first job, I've worked closely with and for a lot of people very different from me. With my law schooling as my education, that work has been my real education, and it continues to this day. My clients took me far beyond my own experience. We started from very different places. Race, age, education, geography, faith, socioeconomic status. But within the lawyer-client relationship, my clients opened up in ways that I just don't think they would have if we had met in other circumstances. I went into civil rights law. I thought I already knew the evils of inequality. I certainly knew things like how to calculate the economic costs to people held back by job discrimination. But it was only from my clients that I could learn about other costs: the hurt, self-doubt, mistrust, and sure, anger sown by bias. I represented a restaurant hostess who was reassigned to the kitchen from the front of the house, under a corporate policy of blacks in the back. She was indignant, but she was also ashamed. I mean, the employer should have been ashamed, but she felt shame. The first African-American police officer on the force of a mid-sized city we represented when he was denied a promotion, he was not only worried about his job future, but when a passing colleague spit on the ground behind him and hissed the N-word just loud enough for him alone to hear, he not only feared for his future on the job, he feared for his life. Another client in Shreveport, Louisiana, sat for her deposition, where I represented her, and then she insisted on taking me to her new job at a local department store. She really wanted to show me where she was working, and she just glowed with pride as she showed me the fine china department that she now supervised. It was as if, after testifying about the discrimination that she had been through, she wanted to end our day together on a note of dignity. Graduates, you will learn from your clients. Your education is just beginning. I also had to stretch beyond the familiar in my teamwork with other lawyers. Just a few years out of law school, I had a chance to work with some legal defense fund cooperating attorneys on a nationwide class action against a chain restaurant that was engaged in rampant racial discrimination. So I went down to Tallahassee, and I lived for a few weeks with one of the local lawyers, Tommy, and his wife and 4 children, while I was getting oriented to the case before going out in the field. I still remember Tommy's 4-year-old daughter at breakfast. She didn't like milk, and so she would pour orange juice on her cereal and eat it that way every day. So shortly after I arrived, Tommy took me along when the company that we were suing was doing a deposition of him. So when you file a class action, the rights of the whole class are on the line, and the judge then has to decide whether the plaintiff's lawyer is adequate to represent the whole class. Tommy was a great lawyer, and he did not seem all that worried. Imagine my surprise when the other side's lawyer asked Tommy if he had ever been convicted of a crime, and Tommy admitted that he had. He'd been convicted of a felony for planning to traffic marijuana from Colombia in a shrimp boat. He served years in prison. He had worked for a decade to restore his civil rights and regain a license to practice law. Working with Tommy forever changed how I think about the hurdles and the promise of people coming out of prison. It had taken him years of painstaking work to rebuild trust and a productive foothold in his community. And there we were, another junior lawyer and I, under Tommy's tutelage, driving all over the South for months, gathering evidence and taking depositions. To this day, he remains one of the most talented lawyers I have ever had the privilege of working with. In fact, because of the evidence we uncovered, the company settled for a record amount, $136 million. My next job upset some different assumptions. My education continued. At the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., in the Office of the Solicitor General representing the United States in the United States Supreme Court, a highlight of my time was writing the briefs in the constitutional challenge to the Virginia Military Institute's refusal to admit women. Now, by that time, all other public institutions of higher education in the United States, including the United States military academies, admitted both men and women. Only the Citadel and VMI excluded women. The VMI case went to the Supreme Court during the administration of President Clinton, but the case had been filed originally under George H.W. Bush. The Justice Department lawyer who did the case in the lower court and who worked with me when the Supreme Court agreed to hear it was a true believer in the case against VMI. Clean-cut, tall, athletic. He looked like he himself could have excelled at VMI. He also happened to be a Republican, and he seemed pretty sure that women and men really are quite different. But for him, the case stood for the classic conservative commitment to open opportunity on equal terms, to any individual who can cut it. I started out more skeptical of asserted gender differences. To me, men's and women's typical behavior and preferences seem shaped, at least in part, by institutions, by stereotypes. And VMI seemed like an institution built on stereotype. But seeing it his way, it made me realize that we could and we should appeal to both ways of thinking. We ultimately won the case. We won it overwhelmingly with only one justice dissenting. Looking back, it's easy to see that the best advocacy that we did in the Supreme Court was the product of many sensibilities. Later, when I became a law professor at Georgetown, I got a call asking whether I might be interested in being lead counsel in a Supreme Court case coming out of South Carolina. Steve came up to DC to interview 3 or 4 different candidates, and he had his co-counsel, Brad, on the conference phone back in Charleston. I had never done one of these kinds of interviews. They actually call them beauty pageants. But I had read up on the case, and I was really excited to have a shot. I walked into the office and met Steve. And while he was shaking my hand, he says in a loud aside to the speakerphone, "Well, look at this one, Brad. Why, she's just a little slip of a thing." I remember thinking, who did they expect? Attorney General Janet Reno? For those of you who do not know, Reno was 6 feet tall and physically very imposing. Well, with somewhat less confidence than I came with, I gave the pitch that I had prepared. I walked out of there sure that an older and more experienced, and yes, larger lawyer was going to get the job. And not only did they hire me, but we developed a great working relationship. We had so much fun together, and yes, we won the case. My point in sharing these stories is that the best lawyers, the best law, the best educations are made through generous human engagement. Generous human engagement with people different from yourselves. At every turn, my clients and colleagues brought to bear their distinct views and values. That could be a recipe for conflict and misunderstanding. In today's hyperpartisan culture, it often is. But we lawyers are trained to disagree without personalizing. When we do that, we make space for each other's ideas, even as we seek to advance our own. And we need that space if we're going to live together. My service as a judge since 2014 has reinforced my faith in our power as lawyers working across differences to more fairly and fully engage the things that divide us. When I was nominated to the court, the Senate had for years grown increasingly embattled over judicial nominees. My court was a particular hotspot. My confirmation process was not easy. After the gauntlet of Senate confirmation, I arrived for work at the court a little shell-shocked. Part of me has started to fear the DC Circuit would be a circus, DC Circuit would be a scrum. My experience could not be more to the contrary. The 17 judges on my court come from all across the country, and we have different personal and professional backgrounds and worldviews. We disagree a lot. We sit in panels of 3. So to resolve any case, we have to find grounds on which we can agree. We talk, we listen until our initial disagreement gets reasoned through and resolved, or we find a narrower ground on which we can agree. Or we write separately, majority opinions and dissents. But we work together on the court as lawyers. We have a common language. Factual conclusions rest on evidence. Legal precedent is binding and cannot be ignored. We have norms of genuine civility. we on my court will be working together for the rest of our lives. We did not choose one another. I was thinking about this, and it's like, we're like a family, but a family grows up together and is related, so we're like an adopted family with no parents, stuck together. It's so funny, judges don't have any role in picking who they work with. They don't get to interview their colleagues before they're hired. So we just have to work together. And working together with people who bring their distinct ideas, values, perspectives to the table, that's the most challenging part of my job, but it's also the most fulfilling and the most rewarding. Our legal training teaches us to bring disagreement to the surface, to bring it out, rather than suppressing or shouting down what someone else wants to say. And it's because we hear one another out, because we're listening, that the other colleagues are likely to say honestly what they're thinking. Right? It's because you're listening that the disagreement will actually come forward. I know it sounds simple, but that is how people get to understand one another. It works. A really high percentage of the decisions coming out of my court are unanimous. The everyday work of a court, the everyday work of any lawyer, if you are worth your salt, is not to use your power to bully others to accede to your view. And it is not to yield your ground for the sake of peace. No. In the face of everything that divides us, our job as lawyers, our job as human beings, is to work conscientiously to help people figure out, with all our differences, how to move forward together. It's as simple and it's as hard as that. Part of me did, and part of me still does, long for easy answers. Part of me wants everyone to agree with my vision. But that is not the nation we have. And my life in the law has taught me it is not the nation we should want. As the writer Marilynne Robinson discusses in a 2016 essay, our Constitution was ordained and established to form a more perfect union. Those words in our Constitution's preamble do not demand or even anticipate a perfect union, but a more perfect union. The phrase, more perfect, Robinson argues, suggests that our union will be improved rather than perfected. A perfect union, Robinson emphasizes, is the wrong goal. She contrasts the United States with many other nations around the world when she says, the idea of the organic society united by blood, faith, language, and culture, attractive as it may sound, actually tears societies apart. Since intolerable difference can always be found, some old wrong remembered. I have come to believe strongly that we must resist the homogeneity of absolute certainty. We must ward it off. We will never reach just one right answer, and it is when we think we can that we risk it all. UConn class of 2018, you know better. You know better than to insist on a perfect union. But a more perfect union? That implies a continuous mission. It is the more perfect that I submit to you is the project of our profession and of our nation. It is our highest calling. A more perfect union calls for an authority not vested in any one of us or in any one party or political vision, but in our collective and dynamic knowledge and ideas, in our listening and disagreeing and working together. So I leave you with this. As new lawyers, you enter the world armed with authority and insight. But the law cannot give you answers. You bring with you your own deeply felt values and commitments. You follow the moral compass that has guided you through life and landed you here. Today, I implore you to bring your whole self to your work as lawyers, including your most open mind. Engage with others with respect, because that exchange is how we acknowledge, how we grow from, and how we abide with the vast plurality of values and people in our nation. It is how we make better law for a better society. If you can do that, and I trust you can, you will be part of the project of making our union ever more perfect. Thank you.